Hey, so quick heads up for this interview. We had a few technical issues with the recording, so it gets a little bit choppy in the middle. I cleaned up the audio as best I could, but the quality is still going to fluctuate a little bit, so bear with us and enjoy the interview. Hello and welcome to Table Talk, a show where I chat with other creators in the TTRPG space about how they run their tables. I'm Danger Dan Jers, the GM and host of D&Dark, and joining us at the table today is an indie creator here to chat with us about his upcoming third-party D&D 5e bestiary expansion, Hidden Folk from the Feywild, Neil from Fey Earth. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming along. Can you get us started by telling us a little about yourself, a little bit about your history with the TTRPG space, with Fey Earth, and with your upcoming Hidden Folk from the Feywild release?
I won't give the whole thing. Let's just say I'm very old. My introduction to tabletop role-playing games was 2nd edition in the 90s.
Oh, nice.
So very OG. But for the last 10 years or so, I have been working on Fey Earth, which is my own indie TTRPG. It uses its own unique D20 system. And the crux of it is it's basically set in an alternate 19th century Earth where all the creatures from folklore and fairy tale are real, have always been real, and live openly alongside humanity. So that in itself makes it quite unique. There are a few other games that are similar to that. In Fey Earth, no, the Fey are and always have been openly a part of life, society, and civilizations. But what makes Fey Earth especially, and I would say almost singularly unique, is that I have, in as much as I could possibly do, depicted all of the Fey and magical creatures in my game as faithfully and as accurately as I can, based on how they were described in their original folklore. And that is something that actually does make it quite unique, because the reality is Gary Gygax got his hands on an encyclopedia of European folklore in the 70s and effectively culturally appropriated hundreds. It was cultural appropriation. It just happened to be white people he was doing it to. But that's what it was. He took names of creatures from folklore that was centuries old and just literally took it because they were cool-sounding names. And if you look at D&D today, you've got all of these creatures in the game, kobolds, goblins, elves, like core creatures that are nothing remotely like they were in their original folklore. Whereas in Fey Earth, they are very much as they were described in the stories of old. And that is something that when people play Fey Earth, they immediately love, because it just resonates with them. The world feels more real, because when they're interacting with these magical creatures in Fey, because they're based on the folklore, they just feel more real than, the random magical things that you get in a high fantasy game like D&D or Pathfinder or stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And from what you've shown me of your upcoming release, it definitely looks like a really interesting jumping off point for homebrew games. So I would love to pick your brain about the folklore that you're drawing from. So you're primarily focusing on European folklore. What are like the biggest cultural touchstones that you're drawing from to make not just specifically Hidden Folk from the Feywild, but from Fey Earth as a whole?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it is exclusively European folklore, okay? I mean, I joke with my friends. I've been working on this for like close to 10 years now. I don't know. I have spent hundreds of euros and thousands of hours researching, to the point where I could probably write most of a master's thesis. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And now, obviously, I'm Irish, if you can tell from my raspy accent, because I was sick last week, but I am Irish, which means that I come from a country which has some of the richest and most well-preserved folklore, not just in Europe, but in the world. It really is. And as an Irishman, we don't realize this. We don't realize that this isn't the norm until you actually start trying to learn about folklore of other countries and cultures. And like, that was the first shock for me a decade ago, was that I started looking at folklore from other parts of Europe. I was shocked at how much of it's being lost, in that essentially, if you were living in a country that was not one of the Celtic nations or Scandinavia, as they are the only places in Western Europe that really preserve their folklore, everywhere else, unless you had an individual like the Brothers Grimm in Germany or Madame D'Aubry in France, who went around and actively searched and collected and recorded the stories, they're gone. Spain, 90% of their folklore is gone. Portugal, it's all gone. Italy, so much was lost except for what was saved by Calvino. It's so crazy. It's not until you get into Eastern Europe and into what many would call the Slavic countries that you suddenly start finding rich, well-preserved folklore again. So you've got like this incredibly rich, incredibly well-preserved folklore in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Scandinavia. Then it's a bit of an oasis until you get into Central and then more into Eastern Europe. But with Fey Earth, and obviously Fey Earth directly influences my new 5e bestiary, I was and did try to have as many creatures from as many parts of Europe as I possibly could. But what was actually interesting about that was the fact that I ended up in a situation where I actually had less creatures than you might expect, because what I was finding in my research was that I was finding examples of magical creatures that were essentially identical, but would have a different name depending on the region. So in Scotland, you have a brownie. In Yorkshire, you have a hobgoblin. In France, you have a cadet. In Germany, you have a kobold. But they are all basically identical domestic fairies that living in homes or sometimes in businesses like breweries and mills. They are almost always invisible. They are described as being extremely strong. Like it was said that a brownie could thrash 10 men's worth of corn in a single night, So I was actually, in my research, as I was creating the stat blocks and describing the creatures for the system, finding situations where I would have one entry in my zoological compendium, but in the introductory line have 3, 4, 5, or 6 or more names for that one creature, saying, in this part of Europe, they're called this. In this region, they're called this. In this region, they're called this. But it was still the same creature.
That's fascinating, and that makes so much sense with what I understand of like mythology and folklore of the different ancient cultures. There's a lot of overlap. I know the big one that people tend to point to is how much overlap there is between like Greek and Roman ancient mythology.
Yeah.
It's the same pantheon, but with different names and different aesthetics.
Basically.
So
yeah,
that's so interesting. When you were doing that research and looking into the creatures from the different folklore across the different parts of Europe, what were like the big surprises to you? Is there anything that jumped out at you as some of the most interesting rabbit holes you've gone down, or like anything particularly unexpected?
I mean, there were some really cool and interesting weird creatures that I came across. Like in French folklore, you got a creature called the Loup-Garou, which was basically a giant man-eating snail, I think 2 meters tall, with this mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. But what makes them especially unique is they had these tentacles that could stretch out for tens or even hundreds of kilometers. So if they faced a person who escaped, they could instinctively seek them out with their tentacles. And there are stories of men like sitting at their kitchen table having their breakfast, and then these tentacles break through the door or window, grabbing them, pulling them back to the creature's lair. Another particularly nasty one, this was from Italian folklore, these horrid creatures called the Musca Macada. They were kind of an allegory for malaria, really monstrous. And they are, both the Loup-Garou and the Musca Macada are in Hidden Folk of the Feywild, by the way. But they were basically houseflies the size of a retriever.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, with a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth and a long barbed stinger tail. But in the stories of the Musca Macada, where you would normally find them is in treasure chests. So adventurers or thieves would go and they'd find their treasure chest, but when they opened it, hundreds or even thousands of these gigantic murderous houseflies would come out in swarms that would then wipe out an entire town.
Oh, that is gnarly.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's also really interesting, like fun creatures that I love. Like, say, there's the kabouter, who are from Dutch Flemish folklore, and they're basically a type of gnome, okay? Really small, tiny little type of gnome, really, really cute, generally quite friendly. If you were good and respectful to them and they liked you, they could maybe give you a gift of luck, so you'd have a boon of luck. But if you were an asshole, they could curse you and mess with your life. But what was really interesting was they were described as a very ethereal creature. They loved human food, but because of their ethereal nature, they couldn't actually consume it. They would take it as a valued gift, but couldn't consume it. And likewise, humans couldn't eat their food. But the other thing that was really interesting about them was they could speak any language in the world, and they were telepathic and could read your mind and would automatically always know if you lied to them.
That's such a good story hook, too.
Yeah, it's great. I was talking to a friend of mine, a mutual online, Signa Mana. She's this wonderful Flemish folklorist. And I was talking to her about this idea, like in the world of Fey Earth, in my own system, that if you're in like Flanders or in the Netherlands, that in rural areas, when people have like legal disputes, they go to the local kabuter who acts as the judge because they know if somebody's lying. So if they make a judgment, everyone trusts it because you can't lie to these creatures. It's impossible to lie to them. But there's like so many fun things. Like it wasn't surprising, but some stuff like reaffirmed stuff that I already kind of believed to be true, and then it was confirmed. Classic example of this was vulnerability to iron. This is a massively popular trope in any stories to do with the Fae in popular culture. But when you actually look at the folklore, 99.9% of Fae creatures did not have vulnerability to iron. This was something that you only and exclusively find in Scottish and Irish folklore. Nowhere else in Europe do you find this. Like you might have singular examples of creatures that get messed around by iron, but nowhere else do you find this generic vulnerability to this material, which everybody thinks all the fairies are vulnerable to iron. Like, no, they weren't. It was literally only in the Highlands of Scotland and in Ireland where you actually find this. You go 100 kilometers south from Scotland into Yorkshire, the fairies in Yorkshire had no problem with iron.
That is so interesting. Just from the examples that you've rattled off, there's so many really good and really interesting launch points for story and world building there. That is, I really admire the dedication to pulling from the real world folklore. Like, as fun as Gygax's world is, the Forgotten Realms certainly leave a lot to be desired. So, for your bestiary that is 5e compatible, did you work to try to make it more setting agnostic? Did you work to try to make like the real world folklore reconcile with some of the issues with the Forgotten Realms? How did you approach that?
Basically, what you'll get in this bestiary is about 70 or so Fey and magical creatures that are already in my own game, Fey Earth. So I already have stat blocks for them in my own system. Now, my system was designed to create a set of game mechanics that make it more easy to accurately portray the creatures and give them the abilities that they should have. So I was taking the stat blocks I had for these creatures from Fey Earth because these stat blocks are entirely based around the folklore. All of the abilities that they have come directly from the stories. And then it was essentially a case of trawling through spell lists from 5e to try and find the closest match to what the creature had in the story. Lots of spells that people don't normally ever pick. So things like Harm and Contagion, two great examples.
Harm is one of my favorite spells.
Yeah, but like a lot of the time in stories, fairies and fae would curse people, and these curses would manifest in different ways. Sometimes they might just be cursed with terrible bad luck, but other times it was a physical curse. So maybe a limb would be withered, or they would become incredibly weakened and lose much of their constitution. Sometimes they'd be blinded or deafened or made mute. And the spell like Contagion is great because that spell literally has a list of about 7 or 8 different things, including blindness, paralysis, fatigue, and you get to pick. So stuff like that was like, oh, that's perfect, you know? Then for other stuff, it's like, I'm doing the best that I can, but I'm working within the system that I'm working with, i.e. 5e. So I have certain limits to what I can actually do. Like another thing that's actually very interesting about this, and something that will be somewhat terrifying to players if your dungeon master does decide to go and buy this book to use in your game. I've got off the top of my head, I think at least 3 or 4 creatures in this bestiary, probably a few more, that can cast at will a limitless number of times per day, greater invisibility.
Ooh.
Because, yeah, because that was such a common ability of Fae in European folklore. They could turn invisible and stay invisible, even when they're doing spells and other shit and like attacking it. No, they would stay invisible. And you know as well as I do, greater invisibility can mess up a party. It's a singular spell, but really can mess them up, you know? And then you got other things like the stat blocks. Quite a lot of the creatures in this bestiary have very high decks. And when I say very high decks, I don't mean 18, I mean 20 or 22. And very high charisma. I mean, obviously, you've got a couple of big boys who've got very hardy, they've got high strength or con, and a few that have got high wisdom or even intelligence. Oh, and a lot of creatures having the, what's it called again? It's evasion. You know, the rogue thing where if you fail your dex check, you still pass it. And if you pass it, there's not. So a lot of creatures having that ability as well. So that's kind of where it all was. It was a case of I had stat blocks for my creatures that were in another system, and then going through the spell lists. Because obviously I've played 5e, but I'm not an expert. I don't know all 500 odd spells or whatever it is at this stage, you know? But it's not just about spells. Like there's other abilities that they have outside of spells. So for example, one example I give is a creature called the Huldra, which were from Nordic folklore, okay? Norway, Sweden, Finland, though they do have different names. What was it? The Sami people, I did call them Utkvar or something like that. So, well, basically, they're this type of, effectively like a beautiful elven maid living in the forest. Now, you could identify a Huldra because they always have a cow's tail peeking out from their skirts, but they are also incredibly strong. In the stories of the Huldra, it said that a Huldra could straighten a horseshoe with her bare hands.
Ooh.
Yeah. We're talking like, strength rivaling a fire giant. Easily. But they have a few other abilities, one of which was this thing called their maddening kiss. If a Huldra were to kiss a person, they would become madly and obsessively in love with her to the point where they would view any other person as being an enemy trying to keep them from her. They do have to perform a melee attack to land the kiss, and then you're rolling wisdom saving throws. And if you fail it, you become obsessed with the Huldra and can attempt a new wisdom saving throw at the end of each turn. But after 3 fails, the maddening kiss becomes permanent, and you need a greater restoration spell or something more powerful to remove it.
That's so interesting. That sounds like an absolute blast to run and deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, and like this is just one example of so many wonderful. So like if you do decide that you're going to have your players do an adventure in the Feywild, or one that I like to have is where you kind of sneaky and you lie to your players and you don't tell them we're in the Feywild, but we're going to be exploring this forest. And the only idea you might have is the trees look a bit more crazy and mad, you know, or the mushrooms are glowing, you know, but like that, you know, everybody's used to stories of someone falling in love with a nymph or a dryad or something like that. But mechanically, when you look at the stat block for nymphs and dryads, they don't have anything like my Huldra has. And I didn't make this up. This is something that comes from centuries of Nordic folklore. And everything in this book is coming from stories that were being told by grandparents to their grandchildren for hundreds of years across the entire continent. And I do mean across the entire continent because I have creatures from Irish folklore, from Scottish, Welsh, British, French. I think the only country I don't have at least one creature from was Spain. No, sorry, I do have Spanish. It was Portugal. But like literally like all the way to Russia. There's about 18, 19 creatures from Eastern European and Slavic folklore in this as well. Some of which will sound very familiar if you're a fan of the Witcher series, you know, creatures like your Leshy. However, it's going to look nothing like it did in The Witcher because it's based on the original folklore, you know?
Yeah, so that just makes me really curious procedurally when you're putting this stuff together for the creatures that do have an overlap that exist already to some degree within other media, like whether it's 5e, whether it's The Witcher or other like Western media that's kind of taken, appropriated, and like changed the form of it. How much of an obstacle was that? So like, for example, the creatures that you've mentioned before that are D&D staples that look nothing like they do in folklore, to what extent did you need to just ignore them entirely and start from scratch, or how much of it was helpful to look at and draw from?
Basically, there are 3 creatures in my bestiary that already have stat blocks for 5e. I didn't bother wasting my time with the rest of them because they're so ingrained. Like the kobold is a great example, okay? And people are obsessed with kobolds. These really cute little dragon guys, okay? Everybody loves them. Everybody wants them as their best friends. They're absolutely nothing even remotely like the kobold from German folklore. There's a really great example that I came across in my research, and I think it was from Dusseldorf, okay? So the kobold in Germanic folklore, they were a type of, as I call, domestic fey creature, like a brownie. They would live in homes or sometimes breweries or mills, and they would help out. You would leave offerings of food for them as thanks, and they would help out with all stuff around the house. You never saw a kobold. They were always invisible. They always stayed invisible, okay? There's a few other versions, like there's the Kabuterman, which is like a marine kobold that would be, you'd find on boats. Oh, and also, and you don't just find this in the Germanic folklore, you find this pretty much across everywhere. If you had a domestic fey creature, a brownie, a kobold, a hobgoblin in your house, if you gave them the gift of an item of clothing, they would leave your house and never return. That's where the story of the elves and the shoemakers gets it. But going back to what I was saying, there was a story I came across. I think it was set in Dusseldorf. I don't remember. They didn't give the time period. But this kobold that was living in the house of a local, a noble, a baron or a duke or something. And in the story, there was a young lad, a servant that had worked in the house. He was a member of the household staff who tricked the kobold, I think got it drunk, and tricked the kobold into breaking its invisibility and revealing itself to the lad. The kobold became so enraged by this, it ripped the lad's arm off and beat him to death with it. So, like, people playing D&D...
It's a bit of a deviation.
Yeah, they hear the word kobold, they think cutesy little dragon guy who likes to hide in a trench coat. There's nothing I can do to remotely bring that back to the original story. But I do have 3 creatures in my bestiary that already have stat blocks for 5e. And I deliberately put them in, partly as a matter of cultural pride, partly as a matter of an FU to tell you, this is what they're actually like. And the 3 creatures are the Banshee, because the reality, the Banshee comes from Irish folklore. The word Banshee literally means fairy woman. Ban is Irish for woman. She is Irish for fairy. They were not undead. They were a type of fairy or elf, and they were a harbinger of messenger of death. That was their entire function in Irish folklore. If you saw the Banshee and heard their wail, then somebody in your family was going to die. And that's what they were about. So the Banshee in D&D is complete bollocksology. It's nothing at all like the folklore. So the Banshee, the goblins in European folklore were extremely magically powerful, highly intelligent, extremely mischievous tricksters. You didn't mess with goblins because they would mess you up, okay? Nothing like the cowardly, stupid creatures that we think of that you throw at your level 1, level 2 party. And then the third creature that I have in my bestiary that already has a stat block in 5e, but which is yet again completely wrong, is a creature from French folklore that you may have heard of before called the Tarrasque. Oh, yes.
So it's not Godzilla.
No, not at all. The original Tarrasque from French folklore, they were about the size of an elephant, all right? So still quite big. They had this enormous armored spiked turtle shell on their back, a huge leonian mouth, and 3 pairs of legs, not 2 pairs of legs, so 6 legs ending in massive bear paws. And they could eat, and a long scorpion stinger tail as well. So still pretty messed up. In many stories, they would swallow a man whole, but more than that, they had this poisonous breath. Most people who met a Tarrasque died before they got anywhere near it because they were overcome by the poisonous breath of the creature.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. So those are the 3 creatures that I put in Hidden Folk of the Feywild that already exist in the 5e Monsters Manual. But I was like, no, this is actually... And also... when you're reading all these creatures, you're like, these are amazing, these are incredible. And then you'll come across a creature that you've fought and faced many times before. And then you read my description, you're like, holy shit, this is completely different. It really hammers home just how much this book that you've just bought is an authentic portrayal of folklore.
That's such a good pitch already. You definitely have me very, very interested just from that little bit of sampling of how much I didn't know. So from a designer standpoint, for people wanting to try to follow in your footsteps and trying to make their own systems or trying to make their own bestiaries, things like that, can you lay down like what your process was in putting this together from start to finish? Whether it's if you want to focus on just the bestiary, if you want to focus on Fey Earth.
My process for Fey Earth was I would not recommend, if you want to get into RPG design, don't do what I did. Okay? Do the exact opposite of what I did. If you want to get into indie TTRPG design, I don't mean making third-party content for 5e, because that's a whole different ballgame. And in many ways, it's a lot easier because you've got an entire system and 50 years of lore and history to build upon. It makes everything so much easier. If you want to actually start making your own indie TTRPGs with your own unique set mechanics, my advice is start small. Start with a very small, simple, rules-like game, something that's 10, 20 pages long. Start small, start simple. Look at a few different types of games as well. Maybe you want to make a couple of solo RPGs and play around with different mechanics. You might make a game that uses a dice pool system or something that uses all of one die. Maybe it's pools of D4s or a pair of D6s, or maybe D20. Play around with different mechanics because the maths does change depending on the type of dice that you're rolling. D&D uses the D20 system, which so many people love because you get your critical fails and your critical successes, your nat ones and your nat 20s, which make for these incredibly awesome epic moments. But that also creates a system that's really swingy. When you go with a dice pool system, whereby you are rolling multiple dice and adding up your dice to get your total, or picking the highest value amongst your total, that creates a much better standard deviation. You've got a much more normalized spread of results. I'm slipping into statistics here. You'll have to forgive me. My day job, I'm a secondary school maths teacher. Okay. So, but no, start small, make some fun, simple games, and get your name out there, selling your game on drive through. If you can get the UI to fucking work for you, it's a nightmare. On itch.io, so people know who you are. Collab with other people too. That's a really great way to get people to know who you are and learn about your content, but also to learn more about game design. Working with other people, you learn so much from working in groups. And then when you've been doing this for a couple of years, then you can go and do something crazy like I did with Fey Earth, creating a game which is easily comparable to 5e, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, World of Darkness, every other major, like my core rulebook is going to be published, please God, at the end of this year. I had my Kickstarter last year and I'm currently working with my artists and editors putting the book together. My book, when it's finished, is going to be about 350 pages long.
That's a pretty hefty one.
Most normal people don't decide on a 350-page game as their first ever game. Now, if you're wanting to do stuff for third party, the advantage of third party is you will make more money. It's a simple fact. D&D dominates the industry, and estimates that somewhere between 90 and 95% of all tabletop role-playing game is 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. It overwhelmingly dominates. So you are more likely to make money making content for 5e. If you are making content for 5e, my advice is try to avoid being derivative, okay? Because there is so much amazing third-party content out there. Try to find something that's a little bit different, a little bit unique, okay? I mean, the thing about my product here, Hidden Folk of the Feywild, it is actually quite unique. There's tons of third-party content that has been written over the years about the Fae, but nobody's ever done anything like this. It's always adventure modules and creatures that have been just completely made up by people. And these can be really cool, fun, quirky creatures. But I am going to say my book is better. If you're making third-party content, try to avoid being derivative. Now, that doesn't mean you can't rob from people and ideas. Absolutely you can. If you have a movie or a video game or a book that you loved, you can absolutely use that as inspiration, And then beyond that, it's just a case of look at what people are interested in doing and try to find something that people are interested in doing, but more importantly, that you are interested in doing and that you will have fun doing. Because if you're not interested and if you're not having fun, there's no point. The reality is making it as a game designer in the TTRPG industry is extremely hard. Virtually no one does it full time. And people get shocked when they realize this. Even the people who seem to be doing great, who have these Patreons of like 300, 400, 500 Patreons, who are producing content and have a book out every year, they have full-time day jobs, Oh, and in terms of skill sets, most valuable skill set to you as an indie designer, art. Learn how to draw. If you can do your own artwork, you have cut your production costs for your product by anywhere from 50 to 70%.
Oh, absolutely. That is one of the things that I got luckiest with for D&Dark is that one of our core players, Jordan, who plays the Wolfman, she does all of our art, and that has been instrumental in everything that we've done.
I estimate that the final art budget for the core rulebook for Fey Earth will be at least 12,000 euros.
That sounds about right.
12 to 15,000 euros is what you would expect for your art budget for a major piece of work like a core rule book or like a large levels 1 to 20 adventure module or something like that, That's just if you are not an artist, I'm not an artist. I have a team of 7 incredible artists who are doing all of the art for my core rule book. The one great thing is because all the creatures and info of the Feywild can also be found in Fey Earth, I'm using all the same artwork. It's amazing artwork, and it's literally the exact same creatures,
Yeah, I get that 100%. The comparable thing for me with our actual play, since we do have our artists working in-house, the big expense for me has been music, because I try to custom commission a lot of original music for our show, and that adds up quick.
Yeah, I'm not. I had an actual play. I had a campaign that I ran for 2 years. We streamed every week on Twitch, and it finished there about a month ago. And I haven't stopped producing content. I'm just no longer doing a long form weekly live stream actual play because it's so difficult. It is such monumentally hard work. Even a pre-recorded actual play is a lot of work, but when it's a live stream, it's just it basically feels like a job,
Yeah, so going off of that, can you tell us about some of those other projects that you're involved in?
I think this is the first place I'm officially announcing this, actually, so you're getting an exclusive. On the 7th of March at, I think it's 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, I am running a one-shot with these 3 wonderful people, a cosplayer, Lilith Wild, based in Canada. Another, you may have heard of her, Korean-American actual play, amazing performer, Stella Luna.
Oh.
Yes, and a certain Canadian amazing TTRPG content producer, the wonderful green-haired Anne Bono.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So we are having a one-shot of Hidden Folk of the Feywild. It's so a one-shot set around the Feywild and exclusively using creatures that are coming up in the bestiary. So that is 7th of March. I think it's 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time is when we'll be live on Anne's Twitch channel. So definitely, if you want to get a taste of this a couple of weeks before the Kickstarter goes live, the Kickstarter goes live on the 2nd of April, this will be your perfect opportunity. We had our session 0 there last Friday discussing the characters that they've come up with are just incredible, absolutely amazing. Lilith decided to go with a warlock with an archfey patron, as you do, and just happens to be in a game where the DM is a bit of an expert. So we were able to pick a very appropriate, very specific fey creature that is in my bestiary as her archfey patron, because why would I bother with your generic basic ass bitch archfey when I can be like, okay, you want an archfey? Do you want them to be Irish? Do you want them to be French? Do you want to be Scottish? Do you want to be Nordic? Do you want to be Slavic? How specific do you want your patron to be? So yeah, it's going to be really fun, super exciting. a bit gay.
It comes with the territory.
It really does, it absolutely does, when you've got such iconic players as the ones I've listed, it's going to get a bit fruity.
Yeah, I get that 100%. Our show, similarly, ours is based on like the classic Universal horror movies. So ours is set vaguely in Victorian England in a fictional version of it that's closer aligned to like the American movies in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, okay. I grew up on those Hammer horror movies as a kid, They were on the TV all the time. Every Friday they were on TV. So I grew up with all of the Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, Dracula movies, the classic. I love that. It's such a great genre of horror, you know?
Absolutely. And the camp elements are so great for both for horror and for whimsy.
Oh, God. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just great the things that you can do with these genres and like with this folklore and with the stuff that you're pulling from. You really went into a lot of great detail about the process and about the advice, and you've basically covered most of the questions that I've got for you. Is there anything that you want to touch on that we haven't gotten around to that you want to make sure that we cover?
I mean, all I'd say is if this is something that interests you, jump on. I'm going to have a €20 tier for the PDF, and I'm literally waiting on some quotes back from printers, which I'll hopefully get in the next few days. But it's looking like we'll have a €30 tier for the physical copy. And it is a phenomenal resource. Even if you're like, Fey isn't your thing, I guarantee you have a buddy who's running a game where the Fey is their thing. So just make sure you tell your friends about it, I suppose beyond that, you can just be following me on social media to keep updates, If you go on to Kickstarter, the profile that it's under is Brambleheart Games. Brambleheart Games is a company that I established myself, registered in Ireland, to publish my game, Fey Earth, okay? So that's what Brambleheart Games is. It is my company that I established and registered so that I could then print, publish, and distribute Fey Earth. But while I technically have social media accounts for Brambleheart Games, I don't really use it. I am very active on Blue Sky at Fey Earth, where you can find all of my content about this Kickstarter, other gaming systems that as well as Fey Earth. I have another really, really fun rules like TTRPG I published last year called Fey Wanderer. It's really funny. I wanted to make a game that would be minimal prep for when it's game night and half of the players have cancelled because they're sick and life has gone in the way, but the other half are still up for it and still want to play. I created Fey Wanderer, where you play a band of Fey creatures on a quest for a treasure in the Fey realm. But I designed it in such a way, the rules are so simple that literally within 15, 20 minutes of sitting down, everybody has made their characters and the GM has the adventure ready to go. That's how simple it is. But the fun thing about it is it uses a simple dice pool system, and it also uses an open magic system. And when I made this incredibly rules-like game with this open magic system, I inadvertently made a game that is perfect for introducing young children to TTRPGs. And kids are actually better at this game than adults because their imaginations are so much better that they just latch onto this open magic system where you basically have spheres of magic and a power word, and you say, okay, so I want to use my earth magic with harden. Okay, well, describe to me what that looks like. Now roll. And it's like, you learn about other stuff like that if you're following me on Blue Sky, as well as updates on things like one-shots like the one I have with Stella, Anne, and Lilith, and other stuff I'm going to have with a few cool people, European gamers, some of whom are in the Euphoria platform as well. And that's what you best place to learn about all my stuff.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Are there any other social links that you want to drop before we head out?
I mean, I have a YouTube channel if you want as I said, I have an actual play series that just finished and we had the entire 2 years of that up. My sessions were, with the exception of the last 5 or 6, they're all 2 hours. The last 5 or 6 were 3 hours. I have a TikTok, but I'm 43 years of age. I feel very strange when I make stuff. All right, but I have an Instagram for Brambleheart Games, but honestly, the best place to find my stuff is Blue Sky, and then check out my VODs on YouTube.
All right, well, excellent. Thank you so much again for coming on and chatting with me. This was fantastic. Once again, everybody, this has been Table Talk. I'm Danger Dan Jers, and I hope you all enjoyed what we brought to the table. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Table Talk, created, hosted, and edited by myself, Danger Dan Jers, with artwork by Jordan Nelson. Our guest this episode was Neil from Fey Earth. Links to his works can be found in the episode description. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, reach out to us at dndarkpodcast@gmail.com. Our theme song and outro was created by Jeremy Vellucci. Check out more of his works on Instagram at JeremyVellucci_Wreck of Time. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time we have a guest take a seat at the table.